Throughout the 1950s, I did this work with a colleague where we looked at the archives in Academia Sinica, in the mainland, as well as in Saudi. And it was very obvious that the People's Republic was really eager and desperate to normalize and open diplomatic ties with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding claims that it was, the fountainhead of Arab conservatism and ideological backwardness. So there's a pragmatism that really runs through China's diplomacy during this era. But it's important to note that because of these types of engagements, right, and these types of political openings, it allowed Palestinians, especially Palestinian leaders, to develop ties with the People's Republic, right? So throughout the late 1950s, for example, a lot of key members of what would later become the Palestine Liberation Organization, which would be founded in 1964, would make their way to China under government tours, right? So for example, 𝗷𝗃𝗄𝗃 is one figure. These are images of him, I think from 1957, and those kind of month-long tours going around to many different parts of China, Hangzhou, going to the 𝗍𝗵𝗄 to visit the industrial sites and whatnot. And this kind of opening ultimately allows for China to establish formal ties with the Palestine Liberation Organization, right? Because prior to this, most of the way in which the Palestine issue was mediated between China and the Arab world was primarily through Arab governments like Egypt, right? So this kind of opening facilitates a development where China begins to interact and interface with those who would claim authority directly. So this is an image of Mohammed Alsudairi, who was the first General Secretary of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and they kind of established ties. And this kind of comes at an inflection point in the relationship, because this is the moment where China begins to enter a radicalization phase, both domestically and in terms of its foreign policy. So as they build these ties become critical for kind of using the Palestinian issue for China's own foreign policy purposes. So you can see the shift in language, for example, formally, where, for instance, imperialism is afraid of China and the Arabs. Israel and Formosa are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same, Formosa being Taiwan. And it's interesting, actually, when you think about also the depictions of Israel in kind of the language of the party state, because in the 1950s, Israel was also seen as an actor that was being used by imperialists, right, to ignite conflict with the Arabs. But here, the whole depiction of Israel transforms, and it becomes kind of part and parcel of the imperial plot. And that needs to be eliminated, right? So this is kind of part of this language. And you can see kind of the growth in this radical phase of a lot of symbolic support that becomes part of this revolutionary memory of Chinese solidarity with the Palestinians. So one thing that happens, for example, in 1965 is that the Chinese state begins this tradition where on the 15th of May, they would have mass rallies for Palestine. And this is a tradition that would be maintained up to 1971, after which it would be downscaled. It's still a tradition that's maintained today. So typically, it's an event that's held at the State of Palestine Embassy. The Xi Jinping, every year on the 15th of May, would send a telegram congratulating the comrades, etc. So it tells you a bit about kind of the continued resonance of these old revolutionary ties. And certainly, the language also of this radical period is one of kind of confidence of its eternal continuation, right? Which is really kind of goes against the very logic of politics. But I like this quote from Liang Zhengzhi, who is the head of the 𝗍𝗏, who said, "We shall not recognize Israel for a minute, for a day, or even for the next 100 years." Unfortunately, the reality of politics is that such statements don't really age well. And actually, I thought of it in comparison to another statement that was said only a few years after this by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. So King Faisal, he ruled from the mid-60s until he was assassinated in 1975. He visited Taiwan in 1971. He was a very close ally of Taiwan. Most people don't know this, but the relations between these two states were very intimate. They have a very interesting military dimension, if anyone wants to raise it in the Q&A. But when King Faisal went to Taiwan, he made a statement along the lines of, "We will never, ever recognize the communists for the next few centuries. And it's true, Saudi Arabia was the last Arab state to recognize the People's Republic, but we didn't even really hit 20 years. But it just tells you kind of the way in which sometimes these statements have an ideological emptiness.